Spycraft Yearly Podcast presents The Tome Travelers.
Well, hi, and hello, and thank you for joining us again on Tome Travelers. Today I've got a special guest, and with us today from Crafty Games, I have Patrick Kapera.
Heyo!
So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
So one of my favorite warm-up questions, as always, for those who listen on my show, is asking game creators how they got into gaming.
So I've told this story a few times. Your listeners may or may not have heard it, although I'm not sure how much play it's gotten. I have kind of a strange background. When I was 8, the school playground, this kid comes up to me. I'd never met him before. And he does what kids do. They're talking about their lives and making friends and whatnot. And eventually, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he invited me over for lunch. Okay, great. So I go over to his house to have lunch with he and his family. And it turns out his parents were really big D&D squids and had been playing D&D for years. And they couldn't find a GM. So what they'd done is instructed their kid, who didn't know D&D either, to go out and rope in some unsuspecting kid that they could train. So from that point forward, through the summer, I had a second education. I went over to their house, and they would crack open the Dungeon Master's Guide, and they would explain the game to me. Mind you, I hadn't played this. They actually just explained what it was and how it was supposed to work. Yeah. And so I ran the game for months before I ever played it.
That's amazing.
And so that's how I got into gaming, and it went from there. I played D&D and a whole bunch of other things that were going on at that point, and then eventually went into building my own stuff and took it from there.
And so now you're the lead game designer at Crafty Games, but this wasn't your first time at a gaming company, so who else have you worked for in the industry?
So I actually, the lead game designer is a mild mischaracterization. Okay. Crafty actually doesn't have a lead game designer. It's two of us. It's my business partner, Alex, and I, and we both are game designers. We both came out of working for Alderac back in the day. I was employed there as a staffer, and I hired him on as a freelancer, and he eventually got to the point where he was co-designing stuff with me while I was at the company. These days, nearly everything we put out goes through both of us. So it's sort of like a brain trust. There isn't really one person in charge of all the design there. But each project has sort of a hierarchy. Like I defer to him on Mistborn. That's his baby. Okay. And he defers to me on the board games for the most part. Spycraft Third is a bit of an unusual animal in that it's being developed simultaneously by the two of us, although we each have different responsibilities on the project. So just to get that out of the way. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so y'all are developing a Spycraft 3 at this point?
We are. Yeah, we have been for years. And I'm sure the people that are listening are going to be like, oh, they're talking about this again. There's a long story behind it. It is in development. It isn't imminent. And we don't tend to talk too much about it anymore because anticipation fatigue is a real thing. And we didn't want to sort of get people's excitement up. We did back in the day when we thought it was going to be coming out and be the next thing we did. And then it became clear as the company evolved that wasn't going to be the case. So we decided to sort of be a little more quiet about it until it was upon us. But yeah, it's still something we work on pretty regularly, and when we get there, it'll be a big thing. So
very happy to hear that. Spycraft is definitely in my top tier of games, and I actually ran it in the last year or so again, and I love it.
Did you run first or second?
I actually tend to run first edition, but I will I'll also pull in some of the rules and other things from second edition, just because, I don't know, I'm kind of one of those GMs that I do a lot of homebrewing and pulling stuff in, and I'm kind of a story-based GM at the same time, which the OGL and a lot of stuff kind of works well for me, but at the same time, sometimes I got to break the rules.
Oh, yes, and we made a couple of mistakes. Back and done it differently, we would have made it a little more modular, really allow for what we wanted, which was people taking this system and putting it into first, or taking that system and plugging it into another game that they run or whatever. It sort of became its own beast. But you and I are very similar in that when I play Spycraft, I play primarily first, well, these days third, but if I'm running in public, I'm running first with bits of second thrown in for good measure. I'm sorry, I totally derailed your second question.
No. That is perfectly fine. For me, though, this entire interview kind of stems from the whole Spycraft thing. So we're a retrospective podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to believe that Spycraft came out 17 years ago now. And we started working on it almost 18 years ago, because it was very early 2001, late 2000 when we started working on it.
So also touching on your career a little bit, so you've won a lot of awards and honors for games that have stood out in the RPG community. What I'd really like to know is, what are the games that you're perhaps proudest of or went beyond what you set out to create?
Well, so speaking of Spycraft, it's definitely the game that I'm proudest of. It's had the most recognition, certainly, but I think it deserves it in a lot of ways. It's sort of a game that almost shouldn't exist. It came out in the very early days of my career. I had started in '98, and so I had only been an active published creator for a few years. And everything at that point, every single day, was learning on the job and doing something entirely new and figuring out my own way with it. So I didn't really have a roadmap. Now I'm 20 years in, and there's a way of doing most things, and we still break the rules quite a lot. But I would say most of the time, if you're attacking certain types of games, you know that you're going to be attacking them from a certain trajectory, and you're going to be looking at them a certain way just because you've been in the business long enough and you're sort of conditioned to do so. But we didn't have that with Spycraft. It was, we want to make a role-playing game, and we want it to be about spies, but not just like the spies that were always portrayed in role-playing games to date. Back then you had Mercenary Spies and Private Eyes, which is currently getting a bit of a revival. You had Top Secret, which got a revival not long ago, and you had a few other games like that. But they all sort of, I felt that they were very focused on almost the methodology of being a spy and not necessarily the experience of being a spy.
Yeah.
And I sort of came at it from an entirely different angle, which is how do we figure out how to make the weight of this job matter at the table? How do we have negatives that go along with all the positives? How do we portray the romance at the table? How do you get the things that you see in the big movies that you love at the table, other than just telling people make your own magic?
Yeah.
And Spycraft came out of a lot of that. It was, we also had a box. We were told use D20. AEG made it clear that was what they wanted. And while we could have fought them on it, and we actually had a whole other system prepared when that suggestion was made, it was clear that was the way that would get the most exposure for the game. And so we decided to go that way instead. And so we had that box to work in, but everything else was, we could do practically anything we wanted. And so we did. And that's one of the reasons I'm so proud of it, because it really was Kevin Wilson, my co-designer at the time, just jamming on what made spies cool. And how to figure out a way to translate that to mechanics.
For me, I mean, this is a game. I mean, yeah, it was D20 system with the OGL, but I really felt that the game itself kind of broke the mold. Like classes and departments, the interplaying of them, I thought was brilliant, because coming out of the OGL and D20 and D&D, there were the classic lineups. You know, your elf ranger, your human fighter. There was always something that lined up. But then when Spycraft hit, the classes and the departments, it was like unlimited possibilities. Nothing really was a requirement. And then the defense mechanic that y'all had, the way that buying equipment was set up, there were so many innovations. What was it that really kicked off all the innovations and the initial vision?
Well, it was a combination of things. It's partly what I was describing earlier, where we just felt like you're young and you feel like you have something to prove, and you've always role-played a certain way at your table.
Yeah.
And it works really well for you, but how do you really codify that for a much larger audience? So that, I think, was the principal challenge, was that Kevin and I weren't trying to design a role-playing game that would work for anyone. We were trying to develop a role-playing game that codified an experience that we found exciting and interesting, that went above and beyond just a narrow definition of every character, and allowed as much freedom as possible for telling the kinds of stories that matter to you. And I think somewhere in the middle, we hit alchemy. We managed to have a system that worked, that people liked, that was balanced, but also had enough narrative room that people could, people felt like the system supported them rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, part of a wave. We happened to be early that time, which was nice. But if you notice, from around the time that 2.0 hit to now, we've been seeing a gradual incline. It eventually became a very steep incline in the number of narrative games out there, and people trying to find ways to create a box for those narratives rather than just a pile of mechanics that tell the same story over and over again.
The whole mechanic thing, especially now, I mean, the gaming business and the gaming fandom have just diversified and gotten bigger. I mean, there were a few years there where it kind of slacked off. It's kind of, video games kind of really took over the forefront, but I feel like it's coming back around. Mm-hmm. But with the system, Spycraft, I know that it went on to be the basis for Stargate and then eventually came back for Spycraft 2. What do you feel system-wise really brought back the desire to relaunch the line?
So it's interesting. Stargate, actually, we internally sort of referred to it as Spycraft 1.5 because we already knew 2.0 was going to be a thing by the time Stargate was in the mix.
Okay.
There were a number of reasons that we were looking at 2.0, and that's how you saw stuff. There were a whole lot of these efforts that sort of almost made it, but there was one that did, but it was Chad Justice's superhero setting. And it was powered by our game, and it did really well. And he figured out a way to include superheroes. Of course, Steve Kenson was doing the same thing over with Mutants and Masterminds, but their take on superheroes with D20 was very different than what we were doing with Spycraft. And I think there were a lot of people that looked at our base system, which was just far enough away from standard D20 and just focused enough on narrative or just open-ended enough that they really wanted to do other things. And so with Spycraft 2.0, it partly came out of this desire to please a lot of publishers that were wanting to work with us to do other things. And that's one of the reasons that it is so crazy inclusive. It's too inclusive. It sort of stops being spies and starts being basically anything you could possibly conceive modern. Eventually, we wound up throwing elves and orcs into the mix with our PDFs. There was a lot of development in that line that sort of like meandered off the trail, and that's where all of that came from. The other side of it was that we had a very robust living community at the time. Living Spycraft was, I don't know, like the fourth or fifth biggest campaign out there at the time. It was really, really big for a little while, and the fans of that wanted something a little bit different as well. They wanted something that was a little bit more hard-coded, that didn't actually allow for quite as much discretion at the table, because with living games, you want the same experience to happen from table to table, because you want the tables to not feel like one had a competitive edge over the other because they happen to have a more forgiving GM or they happen to have a different mix of characters and backgrounds or whatever it happened to be. I personally disagree with that assessment. It's something that I wish wasn't quite as prevalent in the living communities, but it was something that they wanted. And so that played into 2.0 as well, which is one of the reasons that system is a lot more rigid and interconnected than Classic was. So the desire for a relaunch for 2.0 sort of came out of too many masters, I think, and lots of masters. I think if we had been left alone to do 2.0, it would have been probably a different edition. And third, for what I can talk about it, is it's getting very much back to basics. Like Alex and I took a step back, a very long step back, because it's been many years that the game's been out of print, and asked ourselves, well, how do we get this back to the essence of what we felt Spycraft was? And then simultaneously, because it's been 20 years, the market's changed, we've changed, and so we're trying to capture something we feel will speak to people the way the original one did. It's sort of like Alex and I doing what Kevin and I did back in the day, build a bridge into our heads. So, it'll be another evolution of the game. But as extreme, I think, actually, as Spycraft 2.0 was to Classic, except almost full circle, because it's a lot less complex, a lot less dense, a lot less dense, a lot more storytelling.
I'm kind of excited to hear about it. I actually think that would definitely intrigue me, and I would love to see it come.
Yeah, well, when we start talking about it, I'll try to remember to put you on our playtest list.
Absolutely, please.
But we're not there yet. So.
No problem. Yeah, I would love that. This is a kind of a weird question because it's kind of, I think, twofold because there's the gaming side of it, but there's also the whole inspirational side of it. But what are the things that you think really influenced the creation of this game? What really launched the desire for you to say, okay, let's put spies out for role-playing?
So there are really, I think, two different reasons that Spycraft exists. The first is practical, and the second one is passion-based. So I had a short list of things that I wanted to do when I got into the game. Obviously, just like everybody, initially I wanted to design my own game. I wanted to be published, etc. Those things actually happened relatively, well, at least getting published happened relatively soon. So I sort of set my eyes on higher goals. Spies were one of the things that I felt were underappreciated in the market. There wasn't really a spy game like one that I wanted. And there weren't really any on the market at all at the time, except possibly it depends on how you count games like Delta Green or Conspiracy X, which aren't really spy games, but they have a lot of espionage in them. Their focus is elsewhere. So that was part of the reason, was just my desire to see it back on the market. But there was also, at the time, we had done L5R at AEG, and I had been on the team that worked on the creative side of that. And I was there from the ground up with 7th Sea and worked on a big chunk of that game. And AEG was looking for a third game. They wanted to do with something else what they did with feudal Japan and Renaissance high adventure Europe. And there were a few different games that were in the mix for this internally. The biggest two of them actually made it out. Spycraft and Edge of Midnight was the other one, which eventually came out through Studio 2. But Spycraft won that slot and got the full support of the company, which was huge. So
I love that game. The book, when it hit, I still remember the first time I saw it on the shelf with the black and white and silver design of the book, and it was unlike anything else on the shelf at the game store when I went in and saw it. What led your team to the vision for the game, that just the visual elements, and especially, I'm a layout guy. That's where I kind of got started out in the industry myself, was doing book layout. And I love just the little nuances, the silver in the book, some of the choices that were made. What really caused that to come about?
So both editions of the game were driven by cover artists in terms of the visual styles of the product. In the case of the first edition, we found Veronica Jones. Veronica Jones gave us all our covers for Classic, black and silver. And what was interesting about her was she managed to take this source inspiration we had. Our art director at the time was in love with this magazine cover that had been done that featured Solid Snake from Metal Gear Solid. And I was pretty adamant that I didn't want the game to be in nature. Things softened on that, and we eventually did a military year. But the first couple of years, I really wanted to focus just on the espionage end of it, because I feel like the military end sort of sucks all the air out of the room. And so he and I debated this endlessly. And eventually the compromise was that we went with a lot of the stylistic hallmarks from the pieces that he liked, but we went with an artist, evocative and romantic. And so we wound up with this blend of sort of hard-edged, like techno thriller vibe with something that felt a lot softer. It was coming from an illustrator this is not what she would have produced if she was just left to her own devices. We were very much having her work outside her typical box, which was great. Produced something unlike anything that was out there at the time. And the ink on the inside came from John Zinzer responding to a facet of espionage that I kept making noise about in the office, but that we were having a really hard time portraying, especially the physicality of the product, which is the idea that at least when you're talking about like the God King in the espionage realm, the James Bond license, it's all about luxury. And so you want to have something that felt extravagant. And so we stumbled on this idea of doing actual metallic ink. So we went to the printer, and there was a lot of back and forth on it. They weren't even sure if it was possible at the time. We eventually figured out a way to make it work. It was pretty expensive to make it happen. And we only did it for the core book because the pages for the the supplements were paper was different. So like the metallic ink would have just destroyed the paper. There was really no way to do it. So, but we have it in that core book. And so that core book stands as sort of the thing that, both core books actually, stand as sort of the landing pad for that brand. 2.0 happened because we had an artist. I was working with an art director at the time who had found a company called Octographics. I think that's what they eventually wound up being named. I can't remember what they were named at the time. They started under one brand name and they eventually morphed into Octographics. But they were sort of an anime company, and they did a lot of serialized stuff in comic form, which was great because we needed to produce a lot of images in a relatively short period of time for that game, because we were not only producing gearing up to produce the RPG, but we were also gearing up to produce a collectible card game at the same time. And so it would have been an output of hundreds of images. And we didn't want to go the route that you typically do, which is hire dozens of artists and just coordinate all those looks. Now that's a massive undertaking, and it doesn't always come out so great. And we had managed it with L5R and 7C, but I think everybody was sort of really hesitant to have that experience again, because it's just such a juggle and so much work on the art end. So we had found that one studio, and that studio proved that they could do it quickly and that they could do stuff that didn't look hyper anime. It did have sort of a Western vibe to it, even though it still did certainly look like it was coming from the East. And so we settled on that visual look, and then everything else happened from there. The graphic design folks put together their template from that, which is this elaborate computer. It looks like every page is this displayed artifact, and it went from there.
That's amazing to hear, and I really appreciate you telling me about that, especially the whole luxury part of it. Fun question, and this is something I always love throwing this one because I think it kind of shows us as gamers ourselves. I always feel that game creators, we often make games that we ourselves would want to play. So if you could be anyone or anything in this world that you've created, who or what would you want to be?
So can I answer that question twice?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a boring factual answer, I think, and then there's maybe a less boring answer if I reach.
Oh yeah.
So I don't think I'd want to be a character in any of my worlds. I've said this before. Characters in my worlds suffer a lot. You know, they're places sort of bred of conflict, because that's sort of what tells interesting stories. You know, it forges the decisions that make for interesting storytelling, but it's also not a place you'd want to really live. So, like, real answer, no way. I'm happy to write them. I wouldn't want to be in them. If I had to, if somebody put a gun in my head and said, of any game you've worked on, name something you'd want to be, I'd probably be a Cylon. I did the Colony section of the BSG role-playing game way back in the day. It wasn't produced by AG. It was wherever Jamie Chambers was working at the time. They did Smallville and Leverage. Help me out. Hickman. Not Hickman. His partner. His partner on Dragonlance started her own company, and she's
Margaret Weiss.
Weiss Productions. She's going to hate me for not remembering. I'm sorry, Margaret. Anyway, Jamie hired me for the BSG section, which was a blast because I got to work. I got to fill in all the gaps that were never actually filled in on the television show, and they let it all ride, which is fantastic. But being a Cylon in that or any world would be fantastic because I screw up a lot. And it would be wonderful to be able to start over on a resurrection ship. Just pick up and continue.
Oh, no, that's awesome. And that's actually my wife, Roxy, who's also one of my co-hosts on the shows. That's probably her second favorite sci-fi space series. It's probably her favorite that isn't a video game. She is an absolute fan of Mass Effect. But next in line, I mean, above Star Wars and Star Trek is actually Battlestar for her.
I love that setting. I was wondering how she felt about the end of the show, because it's so divisive for people.
She actually really enjoyed it. It's kind of funny. I'm on the other side. She thought it was great, and when it comes to sci-fi for me, I'm one of those people who I loved the first season or two of Battlestar, but I want my sci-fi to be sci-fi, and it was very hard for me to take in some of the religious elements and other stuff for it, even though I am actually a fairly fairly religious person, when I do my sci-fi, I'm pretty hard-edged about it.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we on Earth missed a battle star hidden somewhere underneath the crust of the planet. But other than that, I really dug it. So let your wife know I'm in her camp.
Oh, cool. Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, shameless plug time. If our listeners wanted to purchase Spycraft, or if they wanted to find any other projects that you're involved in, where would they go?
So Alex and I run Crafty Games. Crafty Games is at crafty-games.com. So crafty-games. We sell all our stuff there. We talk about all our stuff there. There's a link to our newsletter on the front page. We haven't actually been terribly prolific with the newsletter. We've always been very nervous about spamming folks. But one of the things that came across loud and clear last year was that people wanted more regular insight into what we were doing before things dropped. So we're trying something a little different this year. We're going to try and put out one of those a month and see, no matter what we've got to say, even if we have very little to say, and just see how that goes. It should be interesting. We have a lot of good projects coming down the pipe, so I think we'll have a lot to say.
I'm absolutely loving. I know it's been a bit, but the Mistborn RPG captured my, immediately captured my wife's attention, as well as the board game, which it's kind of coming in the same world at two different directions, and I think it was brilliant for both of them to come out.
Thank you. Yeah, we got a lot of odd looks when we released the board game. They're like, you play the villains? I'm like, well, yes, you play the heroes already in the RPG. You don't need it again.
Yeah.
And so, that was fun to put together.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. And like I said, we are huge fans of both Spycraft and Crafty Games, and we are just so excited to see what y'all are making.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well,
as long as people are excited to see it, we'll continue making it.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, and we look forward to getting this episode out. This is going to be a bonus episode for our return to Spycraft. We're going to be putting out an episode featuring myself and the other hosts, and we're going to tackle the subject all over again.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait to hear it.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Podcast presents The Tome Travelers.